Welcome back, and in this lesson we're going to talk about what happens when we die. And if you have Anthony's booklet, What Happens When We Die, you can be following along with that or using these videos in addition to the book.
Yep.
And we're going to talk right now a little bit about a biblical view on death and resurrection.
Yes.
And we talked a little bit about this in the last session, but we want to dig a little bit more into this because many religions do teach that you go to heaven or hell when you die, or that you're reincarnated. But again, what does the Bible teach? So Anthony, if you could start by sharing maybe a little bit about the biblical doctrine of man, that we're mortal, and the difference between being mortal and immortal, like in 1 Corinthians 15. And then after that, we'll move on to another topic under the topic of death.
What happens when we die? So we dealt with that a little bit. What happens when you die is that you die. You go to a place that in the Hebrew Bible is called Sheol, S-H-E-O-L, and that means the whole world of the dead, seen as one huge grave. We might call it gravedom. All the dead of all the ages, excepting Jesus, who has been raised from the dead, they're all there currently, sleeping, unconscious, not thinking, because as we mentioned, Ecclesiastes 9, 5 and 10 says there's nothing going on in the grave. Nothing. You don't know anything. There's no activity at all, period. What happens when we die? A free PDF in several languages there. You'll have all the detail of what I'm trying to get over, much more detail than I'm able to say in a few minutes here. But the point is that when you're dead, you're unconscious. When you're sleeping, you might be dreaming at night, it's true, but you're basically unconscious. Death is likened to sleep. The verse, underline the verse, would be Daniel 12, verse 2. In Daniel 12, verse 2, this is a splendid refrigerator verse. You should have it up on the refrigerator. Remind yourself daily of this. It says that many of those who are sleeping in the dust of the ground will arise, some of them to the life of the age to come. That's where we get this eternal life phrase straight out of Daniel 12, verse 2. It occurs 40, 50 times in the New Testament. They got it from Daniel 12, verse 2, which is the most wonderful summary of what happens when you die. You either come alive in the first resurrection, and in John chapter 5, Jesus talks about two resurrections, a resurrection to life, which will happen at that second coming, the one second coming of Jesus, and a resurrection to judgment would be at the end of the 1,000 years. All the rest of the dead who didn't come alive in the first resurrection, they would then face judgment later, and they will be judged according, as will the first resurrection people, according to what they did. Now, we need to say that if people have lived and died with no knowledge of any of what we're saying here, they cannot be judged on the same standard. Jesus famously said in John, if I hadn't come and told you, it's in John 15 twice, if I hadn't come and told you, you wouldn't be guilty. Isn't that a marvelous sliding scale idea? Jesus said to his opponents there, if I hadn't come and told you, you wouldn't be guilty. That's rather reasonable. You can only be judged on what you reasonably could know. And if you live before the time of Christ even coming, you're not going to be held responsible for information you couldn't have had that we now have, and especially with the internet and all the resources. We are really without excuse because all of this information and much more is available online, much of it free. So that's a very important principle. If I hadn't come and told you, you wouldn't be guilty. But now that I've told you, now the pressure is on because you cannot get rid of what you've been told. If you're not listening, then you're not listening. And that's a very dangerous thing. You must listen to the teachings of Jesus and respond intelligently. That's very clear. So
thank you, Anthony. If you could share with us a little bit about the mortality of man, how it started way back in the Garden of Eden.
Way back in the Garden of Eden, where God created man and woman. Most people know about that event. And he then said, I don't want you to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It wasn't time for that to happen. Now, it's a good thing to have the knowledge of good and evil, as we learn in the New Testament, but God did not want them learning that initially. But he did tell them to eat whatever trees they like, but not the one tree. And we all know the story, that Eve was deceived by what's called the serpent. That would be the devil. The serpent is defined as the devil. That's a proper noun. It's the name of a person. It's not just evil in your heart. It's not a personification like wisdom. The devil is an external person. You remember in the wilderness, Jesus was approached by the devil. That wasn't his own heart talking to himself. That's just sheer nonsense. No, the devil is actually a fallen angel. God used that fallen angel who chose to go wrong at an earlier stage. We don't know the detail of all that, but he chose to use that fallen angel as an opposition for testing us. This life is a testing ground. If you want to appoint people to rule and manage the world, you want to be sure what's in their heart. Don't let them loose on 10 cities without knowing what they're really made of. So this testing ground, the world in which you and I live, is indeed a testing ground. And the devil is a real, intelligent, aggressive fallen angel who's determined to lie to you. And he did that very effectively when he induced Eve to eat of the tree which was forbidden. We don't want to do that. So now we must choose against the lies of the devil. I remind you that in 1 John 5:18, it says the whole world, the entire cosmos, is currently in the grip of the devil. That's pretty much blanket coverage. But your only remedy for this then is to seek the truth. The devil is a liar. That serpent is a liar. And that serpent in the Garden of Eden is the devil, as you'll find in 2 Corinthians. Paul defines the serpent who deceived Eve. He calls him the Satan. That's a proper noun, not a personification. So that's what you're up against, and you're up against your own human nature as well. So this is not an easy project. It's going to take your utmost 100% plus effort to work against the lies of the devil and our own sinful downward pull, because we are prone to sin and we must resist that at all costs. So that gives us a start. You are a soul. You are a soul. God created you as a nephesh, as a soul, a living person. The animals are also called souls, living creatures. Your dog is a soul too, a living creature, an animated creature. So we have that in common with the animals. But we, of course, are quite far superior to the animals in terms of ability and intelligence. So our responsibility is all the more great for that reason. So you're called a nephesh in the Bible, a soul, S-O-U-L. And that really means life. You are a living soul, meaning you're a living person, certainly not immortal. You're not going to be given immortality until God has tested you now thoroughly in this life. And then he's going to decide to give you immortality only at the future return of Jesus at his second coming. And I'll use the Greek word for the second coming, parousia, beautiful word, meaning the one future spectacular second coming of Jesus to raise all the faithful dead, including Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all the prophets. They're going to be in that kingdom. So that will be a grand reunion of all the prophets and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, together with all of the true Christian people scattered across the world right now. And that's going to be a party like you won't imagine, an indescribable day coming.
I look forward to that. And as you mentioned, Anthony, about the Garden of Eden, we know from Genesis 2:7, there's a simple equation.
Yes.
That God created man from the dust of the earth. He breathed into his nostrils the breath of life.
Yes.
The spirit that you talked about, the breath. Yes. And he became a living soul or a living being. And
absolutely.
So if we take one of those two away, he becomes a dead being.
A dead soul, and that is a biblical phrase. You can be a dead soul. That's a soul without any breath. I'll note, Tracy, since you talked about the breath of life, the first occurrence in the Bible of that beautiful Hebrew word ruach, which means breath, is found in the evening of the first day, I think. There was a cool breeze blowing in the Garden of Eden. That word is ruach. That gives you the idea of spirit, which is invisible, power, like the wind, and that's God or Jesus indistinguishably now operating in various ways in our lives to guide and direct us. That's ruach. And you are then, as you rightly said, when you are made a living soul, you have dust from the ground combined with this ruach spirit, creating a living nefesh or person or soul. So that's a lot of information. Very basic, though. These are things that really should be taught in Sunday school, and they're on every Sunday.
And we know from Noah that 8 souls were saved.
Good point. 8 souls, that's to say 8 persons. If you want the Bible word for person, it is nefesh, it is soul. 8 souls, 8 persons only. That shows how bad the world got in a few years. Isn't that amazing? Only Noah and 8 souls in all were doing well enough to be spared the deluge or the flood. So that was an extraordinary event, yes.
I'm just going to mention a few verses here that you brought up in the last lesson about Psalm 6:5, where there's no remembrance of God in the grave.
Good point.
Ecclesiastes 9:5, where the dead know nothing.
Yes.
Psalm 13:3, the sleep of death.
Good.
And Psalm 146:4 and 115:17 about our thoughts perishing.
Good.
And maybe we'll just end this section here. If you could mention about 1 Kings 2:10 about sleep with the fathers, and then maybe tie that into Hebrews 11, which is our hope and their hope as well.
Very good. The one in the Old Testament you mentioned there, the standard way of talking of death in the Old Testament is that they fell asleep with their fathers. Their fathers had died, their ancestors had died, and so people fall asleep in death. They don't pass on. They don't pass away. That's totally misleading. So forget that sort of language. And then you rightly mentioned Hebrews chapter 11, where he goes through a list of all the famous heroes of the Old Testament times. And he says all of these people, including Enoch and Elijah, they didn't go to heaven as immortals. They were taken away to a different physical place on the earth, and they died later. And he says all these died, including Enoch, including Elijah. All these people eventually died not having received promises. That's in Hebrews 11, verse 13, I think. That is a wonderful summary verse worthy, excuse me, of a place on your refrigerator. All these died not having received the reward of the inheritance, which is Colossians 3:24. God is very pleased to give you a reward if you prove your love for him now by obeying him and sharing truth wherever you can in the Great Commission to preach the gospel of the kingdom.